firing up all throughout the country. Russia is targeting both military and civilian targets. We are being hit from all over the place, on the ground and in the air, and also from the seaside. And I guess the Ukrainians are still in shock of what we are seeing, what we are experiencing, and what we are living through. It's worse than any kind of nightmare you could have ever dreamed of.
You say Ukrainians are still in shock. Until very recently, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was downplaying the risk of an invasion to avoid panic. And a poll from earlier this month found that only 20.4% of Ukrainians thought that a full-scale invasion would happen soon. Did you see this coming?
I was hoping this would never come. I have learned in these 8 years to hope for the best and prepare for the worst, as did many other Ukrainians. But to be honest, nothing can prepare you for a full-on war with the biggest military power in Europe, third biggest military power in the world, and a nuclear power. There's nothing that can prepare you to withstand that on your own. So really, when the president of Ukraine was saying that, okay, look, we're at war for 8 years, we know what's going down. We had these threats of escalation and so on throughout the years. All of that was absolutely true. And I mean, to have the population in panic and in fear would have caused havoc in the streets and would have actually played very well into Putin's big master plan to eradicate independent Ukraine from the face of the earth. But instead, the population stayed put. There was a feeling of unity which was growing, and that feeling of unity is what is helping us right now withstand this attack.
In Putin's speech to announce this attack on Ukraine, he talked about how, quote, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country. He said that it was, quote, an inalienable part of Russia's history, culture, and spiritual space, and that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia. Given this mindset, was there any chance that Ukraine would have a chance to function as an autonomous, a truly autonomous state?
Yes, and this is what Ukrainians are fighting for. And this is why myself, all my parliamentary colleagues, the government, the president are asking of our Western allies. Clearly, what Putin has declared in his crazy, mad speech is a pack of lies, carefully drafted for him by some Kremlin masterminds with an equally perverted mind and lack of knowledge about history whatsoever. So Ukraine is an independent country. Ukraine is not Russia. Ukrainian people love their freedom. We fight for our freedom. We bring our children up with the love for freedom. And this is what we're doing essentially now. We are fighting on the defensive against an offensive from Russia to have the right to exist and to live. And I think that, well, any nation in the world and any leader in the world would be doing the same. They would be fighting for their country and the right of their country to exist.
In that same speech, Vladimir Putin also made the point that NATO exercises have been taking place in Ukraine over the past few years. And he said that military contingents of NATO countries have been almost constantly present on Ukrainian territory under the pretext of exercises. Given that NATO has always been used as an excuse by Moscow, do you think that NATO's involvement in Ukraine, carrying out exercises, but falling short of giving Ukraine actual NATO membership, has it ultimately hurt the country?
Look, Ukraine needs NATO and NATO needs Ukraine in order to stabilize relations with Russia. That is, as soon as Ukraine becomes a full-on member of NATO, that's it. Putin has nothing else to fight for. The spheres of influence, as he likes to call it, would have been decided and over and game. But
respectfully, the approach that's been taken so far, that is to say the NATO exercises, the lack of full NATO membership, did it give Putin the pretext necessary to engage in the actions we've seen over the last 36 hours?
Putin, if it wasn't for NATO, Putin would have found another pretext. Because Putin wants Ukraine inside of Russia and does not admit an independent Ukraine. Putin is crazy, and this has been proven time and time again, starting from his speech, starting from the show trial style way he made his decisions to invade Ukraine and have recognition, so to speak, from his people to invade Ukraine. Look, we are dealing with a psychopathic leader of a very, very big country, of a very big army, and of a nuclear state. And I think that the world should really be mindful of that and not give in to his lies and his manipulations, and be aware that if we are all to coexist normally, we should follow the rules set up for us after World War II, which work pretty well, I guess, and when countries follow them. But when one country starts falling out from those rules, it's the responsibility of the international community to stand up to it. It says so in the UN Charter, which all these countries that are now NATO allies, they have signed it together with Ukraine. So it's now the responsibility of the international community to stand up for Ukraine, because Ukraine has done nothing wrong. We have made a free choice as a sovereign state. We have not threatened Russia in one way or the other. We have made a decision about how we act with our own territory, with our own military, and who are our partners. Russia didn't like it. So Russia uses its force and its might to invade Ukraine. I think you can sort of sense here who is in the wrong and who is in the right. Like, how can Ukraine, a much, much smaller country with a much, much smaller and less developed army, be a threat to, I'm sorry, I repeat myself, but the third biggest army in the world and the biggest army in Europe? How?
We can agree here that Russia is clearly the aggressor. Last week, President Zelensky appealed to the international community as well, as you have just done, saying we don't need your sanctions after the bombardment will happen and after our country will be fired at, or after we will have no borders, or after we will have no economy. Why would we need those sanctions then? Multiple countries have now announced that they will impose unprecedented sanctions on Russia. Do you feel that this is ultimately too little, too late?
What are these unprecedented sanctions? Where are they? I don't see them, honestly. The unprecedented sanction would be the SWIFT. Why Ukraine wants to switch Russia off from the SWIFT? SWIFT operations are used with Russia to buy oil and gas. Oil and gas are the main commodities, resources which feed the Russian economy. If they're switched off from the SWIFT, it means that they don't get the payments for the oil and gas. So immediately we sort of kill two birds with one stone. There's also this, isolation of Russian markets and of Russia's biggest markets. And clearly, this would be the sanction which hit the most. Just switching them off from the SWIFT and finding another way to pay for their oil and gas, well, of course, they won't care about switching off from the SWIFT in that regard. So it has to come together. Today, I think that the only right and correct, both morally and legally, thing to do of the international community is provide Ukraine with enough defense capabilities and actually get contingents here into Ukraine so that we can withstand further blitzkrieg attacks from Russia, and two is to impose such sanctions that would actually isolate that country, or rather that crazy leader, from the rest of the world, because the world does not need to be poisoned with the toxicity of a totalitarian regime.
In an address to the nation on the first day of the invasion, President Zelensky said, "We have been left alone to defend our state. Who is ready to fight alongside us? I don't see anyone." You've talked about the kind of sanctions you'd like to see, the type of moves you'd like to see the international community engage in. Is there anything else you need the international community to do, to recognize, to engage in order to see the current crisis end quickly?
Look, the international community can choose either to act or to continue with just political statements. Political statements are very nice. We are very grateful for them. They show whose side people are on. But look, when you do tweet the hashtag stand with Ukraine or support Ukraine, it's not enough. It's not going to stop the Russian missiles and the Russian planes hovering over Kiev and the Russian tanks moving into our roads and destroying them completely, along with villages and along with innocent civilians. What needs to be done is really show us if you're prepared to stand with us, because you're standing with us, not just for the sake of Ukrainians and a pretty big country in Europe as well. You're standing with us for your own safety and security. What we need now is actually UN peacekeeping contingents in Ukraine, since we are not NATO members. Okay, fine, fair enough. But UN, with the General Assembly, can adopt a resolution on sending peacekeeping contingents into Ukraine. They don't need the Security Council for that. We can go the same way that it was done in Korea in 1950.
We've seen pictures of bombed out residential buildings. Amnesty International says that it's confirmed that civilians were killed in a ballistic missile strike outside of a hospital in Volhodar in eastern Ukraine. Ultimately, what would be the human cost of all of this for the Ukrainian people?
It will be huge, because it's not just the immediate casualties of war that we are still counting, but it is also the future of our children and the mindset with which they grow up in. I'm a mother of 3. My oldest is 8 years old. He's a boy. And already I can see the damage this is doing to him, hearing all the airstrikes, sirens, seeing all the planes, having to constantly go down and seek shelter. This is what the future Ukrainian generations are going to grow up as, with a lot of psychological issues because of the war. And that has to also be known and understood. But so far as about civilian targets, 33 civilian targets have been hit in the last 36 hours. This is absolutely inhumane and unacceptable. 3 of those targets were kindergartens, children. They don't stop at nothing, those people, and their crazy leader.
Will you stay in Kiev?
I'm staying because I'm a member of parliament. I have a responsibility to my people, and I have a responsibility to my country as a national, as a citizen in Ukraine, that was born in Ukraine, that was raised in Kiev. And also, I have responsibility to my family. Today, Ukraine is mobilized, meaning that everyone who can hold a gun is fighting and is holding that gun against the Russian aggressors. There's no way I can leave for a whole bunch of reasons.
Lesya Vasilenko, thank you so much for joining us on Upfront.
Thank you.
In the past year, the ice cream company Ben & Jerry's was accused of terrorism. Actress Emma Watson was called an anti-Semite. Actor Mark Ruffalo faced virulent attacks on social media, and a full-page ad in the New York Times portrayed musician Dua Lipa and models Bella and Gigi Hadid superimposed over an image of a Hamas rocket. What do they all have in common? Speaking out in support of Palestinian rights. But the backlash isn't limited to high-profile companies or even celebrities. In recent years, there have been hundreds of cases involving censorship and silencing of those in the West who advocate for Palestinians. Is the label of anti-Semite being used to suppress voices calling for human rights? Joining me now to discuss this are Dima Khalidi. She is founder and director of Palestine Legal, and Barry Trachtenberg. He's a professor and historian of Jewish history at Wake Forest University. Thank you both for joining us on Upfront. Dima, let me start with you. How is it that standing up for the human rights of one group of people, Palestinians, has come to be equated with anti-Semitism?
Well, I think we have to understand that this has been something that's decades in the making. We're talking about a state, Israel, that has done everything in its power to prevent a people that it occupies, that it has dispossessed, that it oppresses, that it practices apartheid against. It's done everything in its power to prevent Palestinians from gaining self-determination, from gaining their human rights. And so one of the main tactics that, again, has been decades in the making is an effort to smear anyone and everyone who questions Israel's foundation on the dispossession of Palestinians as anti-Semitic. The other pillar of that, as you noted, is to smear them as terrorists. If they resist, if they, question Israel's practices. So we have to see it in this broader and much longer historical context of the ways that Israel has been trying to repress growing solidarity movements with the Palestinian people. And this effort to specifically redefine anti-Semitism in a way that encompasses basically any criticism of Israel has really gained ground in the last several years, in particular, to the extent that this definition has been codified in laws around the world, including in the U.S. and Europe, especially.
Barry, backlash against celebrities and companies makes the headlines, of course, but there's also widespread retaliation against those who are less high profile, including really especially college students, academics. How has this issue affected campuses and scholars?
What this does is it forces students and professors to really self-censor in profound ways. We've had a number of high-profile cases in the academy of professors who have lost their jobs, been denied job offers, who have faced regular assaults on account of their scholarship, which is peer-reviewed, it's accepted by the profession itself, but very often it's outsiders, potential donors to universities, supporters of Israel, who mount large media campaigns to try to get those professors defunded, to get them stripped of their titles and get them kicked out of the universities. Student groups also face this. At Fordham University, there's a group of students who've been advocating for justice in Palestine for years who cannot get their organization formally recognized by the university because the message has gone out that they are anti-Semitic, when there's no hint of that whatsoever. And there's many Jews who want to participate in this movement who are also banned from doing that work.
Dima, to Barry's point, one of the things that is remarkable about the backlash is that it has affected even Jewish people. Even Jewish people have been accused of anti-Semitism. Senator Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish and lost family in the Holocaust, he's been accused of anti-Semitism based on his view that the U.S. should not be an apologist for the Israeli government, as well as for his support of Palestinian rights. A Likud minister accused Natalie Portman, who is Israeli and American, of engaging in borderline anti-Semitism when she declined to go to Israel to accept an award out of protest against former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's policies. What do you make of the fact that even Jewish people are being censored and accused of anti-Semitism?
Well, as Barry alluded to, this really is about policing, first and foremost, Palestinian expressions of their own history, their own experiences, their own reality under Israeli oppression. And it also functions to make pariahs of anyone who stands in solidarity with them, who expresses support for Palestinian freedom, who criticizes Israel's own practices. And so I think it's part of the current developments over the last 10 or so years, where you've seen increasing questioning within the Jewish community of Israel's practices. And that's in large part due to a strong grassroots Palestine solidarity movement that has really integrated Palestine into the progressive movement.
Barry, there's also a generational piece to this as well. We're seeing divisions grow between younger and older generations of Jewish Americans as well over Israeli politics. One Jewish writer for Rolling Stone put it, she said she was raised to, quote, unequivocally support Israel, but she also explains that because the conflict is defined by, quote, either you support Israel or you support its destruction, it's difficult to, quote, even consider the other side. Do you see a move toward younger people, younger Jewish Americans in particular, supporting critiques of Israel, and if so, why?
It's happening, I think, because of the gap between sort of the promise of Israel and the reality of Israel has just grown so great. And as younger generations are paying more attention to questions of racism in America, of systematic oppression of people of color, of engaging in issues of queer rights, people recognize that there can't be this exception for Israel. And my students, when they come into my class that I teach on the history of Zionism, many of them have gone to Israel on these free trips that are provided to college students, for Jewish college students, called Birthright. They've been raised going to Jewish summer camps. They've been raised having a full-on sort of Zionist education, but they come to my class really troubled by what they see on the news, right? So I had many students in my class this fall who were really worried because at the time when they were signing up for classes last spring, there was the takeover of Sheikh Jarrah and communities in Sheikh Jarrah just outside of Jerusalem. And students signed up for my class because they wanted to know more about this history. So I think larger numbers of students are starting to engage in this question critically, and they're looking to professors to teach that work. But very often teachers are sort of held back. They're restrained from teaching this kind of history because the penalties for doing so can be so high.
Dima, anti-Semitism is on the rise with sharp increases in anti-Semitic incidents and acts of violence in recent years. At the same time, so is the suppression of Palestinian advocacy. In 2020 alone, your organization documented at least 213 incidents of suppression, including smear and harassment campaigns for those supporting Palestinian rights. What are the consequences of restricting the range of opinions allowed about Israel and conflating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israeli policies?
The consequences are quite stark. This is about people's reputations, about people's jobs, about the way that we can operate and talk in a civil society. What we see at Palestine Legal, hearing from hundreds of people every year, is that there is what we have termed a Palestine exception when it comes to free speech in this country. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? When we look at the ways that Israel and Israel advocacy groups here in the US have attacked Palestine advocacy through harassment campaigns or legislation that is curtailing our right to boycott for Palestinian rights. These are templates for how the far right in this country is attacking other movements as well. The same kind of legislation is now being used to attack the environmental justice movement, to attack the efforts to curtail gun rights, the proliferation of guns in the US. We already see legislation being used against other movements. So we know that Palestine might be easier because it's a less popular opinion to support Palestinian rights in general. It might be easier to suppress speech for Palestinian rights, but it really is the kind of icebreaker for the curtailing of and the undermining of all of our First Amendment rights. So it starts with Palestine, but it doesn't end there. And that's why we all have to care about this.
Dima, Barry, thank you so much for joining me on Upfront. That's our show, Upfront. We'll be back next week.
Romania's ancient forests, some of Europe's most pristine.
एयर इंडिया की तीसरी फ्लाइट रोमानिया के रास्ते 2 फ्लाइट में पहुंचे 469 लोग।
नया वाटर प्योरीफायर।
ओहो, पुराना ले लिया।
दादी बॉक्स तो
futuristic and inclusive,
people-friendly and progressive, creating new possibilities of infrastructure, investment, growth and jobs.
big public investment for modern infrastructure, readying for India at 100. This shall be guided by PM Gati Shakti and be benefited by synergy of multimodal approach.
New milestones for Digital India.
इस बजट का भी फोकस गरीब, मिडिल क्लास और युवाओं को बुनियादी सुविधाएं देने और आय के स्थायी समाधानों से जोड़ने पर।
Join the exclusive conversation on Union Budget, perspective of industry leaders. Watch DD Conclave on Union Budget 2022, 28th February, Chennai.
Hello, I'm Emily Angwin. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha. Also coming up.
We will stop Putin from using his war chest.
Western allies swiftly agree to cut some Russian banks from an international payment system. Thousands on the move. Ukrainian families head across the border.
मेरी पॉलिसी मेरे हाथ अभियान की शुरुआत, किसानों को मिलेगा फायदा, सीएम ने अधिकारियों को चेताया।
जब उनकी सरकार थी तो वो तो कहते थे नुकसान लिखो ही मत, कम से कम लिखो।
ये शौचालय था यहाँ पे और इसको उखाड़
हाँ, सब उखाड़ कर सब दीवार उवार सब गिरा।
Welcome back from the break. I'm Uday Pratap Singh. You're joining us on News X. Uttar Pradesh is all set for the 5th phase of polling. As many as 61 constituencies are going to polls today, including Ayodhya, Amethi, Kaushambi and Prayagraj. The state has started to close in on a high-octane, fiercely contested battle, which is now moving towards eastern UP. We at News X this morning are all set to give you the flavor from on ground with my colleagues who are reporting from several of these constituencies, as well as the sharpest analysis here from the studios with our expert panel that's live with us. Amit Jilani, political analyst, is with us live. Let me quickly rope him in. Amit Jilani, your view on the 5th phase, which are the key battles you are looking out for, and which are the issues that now you believe have begun to dominate the narrative? A lot of issues have been picked up on the campaign trail by all political parties, but now one or two are dominating the narrative. Which are those according?
कई तरह की तस्वीरें और वीडियोस वायरल हो रहे हैं। फैक्ट चेक टीम की पड़ताल में कई तस्वीरें और वीडियोस गलत साबित हुई हैं, इसलिए वायरल हो रहे इस वीडियो की भी पड़ताल करना जरूरी था। पड़ताल के लिए हमने कुछ बातों को ध्यान में रखा। मसलन, पहला, क्या वाकई यूक्रेन पर रूस के हमले का वीडियो है? दूसरा, वायरल वीडियो को लेकर किए जा रहे दावे का आधार क्या है? और तीसरा, क्या यूजर्स को गुमराह करने के लिए वीडियो को वायरल किया गया? पड़ताल के लिए सबसे पहले हमने वायरल वीडियो के की फ्रेम्स को सर्च इंजन यांडेक्स पर खोजा। ऐसा करने से हमें बोरिस नाम के एक व्यक्ति की इंस्टाग्राम पोस्ट मिली।
రెండవ ప్రపంచ యుద్ధం తరువాత ప్రచ్ఛన్న యుద్ధ సమయంలో ప్రపంచం రెండు ధృవాలుగా చీలిపోయింది. యూనియన్ లీడర్ అయింది. రెండవ ప్రపంచ యుద్ధం ముగిసిన 4 సంవత్సరాలు
of hair growth. In the active anagen phase, the hair grows.
ഈ നയതന്ത്ര തലത്തിലുള്ള സമ്മർദ്ദം ഉപയോഗിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് മറികടക്കാനാണ്
सीएम सिटी गोरखपुर के पिपराइच विधानसभा अंतर्गत बासस्थान में शनिवार को समाजवादी पार्टी के राष्ट्रीय अध्यक्ष अखिलेश यादव की जनसभा का कार्यक्रम आयोजित किया गया था। इस दौरान पूर्व मुख्यमंत्री अखिलेश यादव द्वारा साइकिल पर बटन दबाकर गोरखपुर के 9 विधानसभाओं में जीत दिलाने की अपील की गई। इस दौरान पूर्व मुख्यमंत्री अखिलेश यादव ने अपनी द्वारा की गई घोषणाओं के बारे में बताया। साथ ही पिपराइच विधानसभा के सपा प्रत्याशी अमरेंद्र निषाद द्वारा दिए गए घोषणाओं के बारे में भी बताया। आपको बता दें कि पूर्व मुख्यमंत्री अखिलेश यादव जी की जनसभा में जनसैलाब देखने को मिला, जो जीती जागती तस्वीर में आप भली भांति देख सकते हैं और उनकी घोषणाओं को भी सुन सकते हैं।
चाहिए, रोजगार की बात होनी चाहिए। ये सब मुद्दे रहेंगे अयोध्या में कि नहीं?
सबसे बड़ी मुद्दा ये है कि
की बात कर रहा हूँ,
वो कह रहे हैं बुलडोजर चला।
मैं बता रहा हूँ ना, सुन तो लीजिए पूरी बात।
माफिया पे बुलडोजर
जो इनके माफिया हैं, जो इन
ये आत्मसम्मान का विषय भी अब रूस के लिए बन गया है कि वो कब तक इसी तरीके से युद्ध लड़ता रहेगा और कब घुटनों पे लाएगा यूक्रेन को।
और इस मैप के जरिए आप समझ सकते हैं कि सबसे बड़ा फोकस कहां पर है, कीव, जो कि राजधानी है यूक्रेन की। इसकी जो लड़ाई है सबसे महत्वपूर्ण है, क्योंकि आपको बता दें व्लादिमीर पुतिन ने जब ऐलान किया था कि वो यूक्रेन पर हमला करने जा रहे हैं, उनका फोकस सिर्फ एक ही था, डीमिलिटराइजेशन, और साथ ही साथ दूसरा मकसद था कि किस तरह से सत्ता का परिवर्तन